So as your sensei and the person responsible for your learning and training, how I want to go about that is trying to be clear and sincere and ethical about it. So some things that I think are very important is that I want to transmit things to you in a way that I would have wanted them transmitted to me. In fact, the way that I'm teaching it is definitely not the way or the ways that I learned it. So I'm trying to streamline the process. I'm throwing in all the things that I've learned over the years, trying to pass that down all at once, and my methods for doing that as an example. So from this point on, each chapter is now going to be in like 4 segments. So the first segment, all of them will identify the part in the chapter, but each segment is going to be in 4 parts. The first segment is going to be called PROMETHEI, which is plural for Prometheus, and basically it'll entail my, as the name says, forethoughts. So just kind of like in leading in or segue, the things that I would think about for this method or technique, and that are kind of personal or just things that I want to throw in there. The second segment is showing you the basic method or form. And basically what we're doing at this stage is I'm assuming that you have never seen the method before, and therefore we are in the process of clarifying and identifying the method and the form. So basically the equation that we're learning is going to run from kind of left to right, where we go from structure to understanding the variables to understanding how it functions. Okay, and there's a process that we're going to be learning in learning the variables, what I call the P.A.D.P.I.E process, or P.A.D.P.I.E, and that stands for problem. Actually, it's my method of the nursing process, which is assessment, diagnosis, plan, implement, and evaluation. The thing that I think that the nursing process kind of doesn't say that should be in there is the first part, which is the clarification of the problem. So therefore I put problem in front of assessment. So I call it P.A.D.P.I.E instead of AD.P.I.E, which is how it is in when you're learning things about nursing. So the third stage, or the third segment, we go into the advanced variations of the method or the form, and there we get into unique solution creation, and kind of like the jazz, where if the second segment is like, you know, learning the scales, the third segment is like learning to jazz, where you're playing with the process and you're learning to come up with different things. So that way the equation is actually running from left to right, in that it goes from function to variables to structure, and we kind of see what we could just kind of come up with, which is what makes it really fun. The fourth and last segment is what I call EPIMETHEI, which is plural for Epimetheus. Epimetheus, if you remember, was Prometheus's brother, and his name means afterthought. So Epimethei are my afterthoughts. So after all has been said and done, the things that I just want to finish up with. And so with that, we're going to get into the basic process. Actually, we're going to get into the PROMETHEI process first, and my forethoughts before we get started. Okay, here we go. So this is the PROMETHEI section, my forethoughts, and I know I said it a lot before, but the hand drill, it will tear up your hands. Okay, so after a while you really have to give your hands a real rest. I got a whole bunch of blisters in here right now that are just healing just from doing this this chapter alone. And so I've been giving my hands kind of a rest, but I got a blood blister here, I got another one in here, I got a callus going here, and it's really terrible when you start to get a blister under the callus and just have that whole thing come off later. But it took me a long time to kind of really get hand drill down. In fact, when I first started learning it, I kind of put it aside for a while. I didn't even really get it at first, and it was probably about a year before I finally got it. That, and it took me a while to get my first bow drill too. I didn't get it after a while, and I kind of put it on the side, kind of went on with life. But then I started picking it all up again, and you know, once I started getting calls, it just, you know, you couldn't stop me after that. It was like things like really took off. But I didn't really have someone there to always show me, and a lot of it was trial and error. So hopefully with all of this, we're going to get through, you're going to have a lot less trial and error as we kind of just go through this. So I can remember specifically this one time I was in my basement, and I was trying to practice the hand drill. It was like freezing outside. I remember it was winter, and so I was doing it in the basement, and I remember I got my first coal, and I remember I had this horrible blister on my left hand. Even though I'm right-handed, it seems that I always get most of my blisters on the left. I put a lot of pressure on the left when I'm doing the hand drill, and I remember I wanted to do it again, and I just wanted to keep going. So I remember spinning the stalk, and I had a pretty good blister under there. I could feel it, but you know, I just kept going and kept going, and all of a sudden I see this white thing shoot out from between my hands, and I go, what was that? It was, and I look down at my hand because it really started to hurt, and the blister had entirely come off. The skin had entirely come off, and I had like this dime size like hole in my hand from where the skin was, and let me tell you, that really hurt. And I definitely stopped for a while after that, you know, and I was having so many successes, and I just wanted to keep going, but you come to realize after a while that you just need to stop for your own health, and just kind of give your hands a rest. So remember to do the same, and if you're teaching other people, remember to remind them to do the same thing too, because it's important, because they need to function with other things. You know, if you need your hands for work and things like that. All right, so just really keep that in mind. All right. So here's an example of what I mean by understanding the structure. Okay, I have here hand drills and the base boards. So if you've never seen this before, how do you make sense of this? Well, you've already seen the basic form. I showed you that before. So let's put it into a pattern that we can understand. What does this mean? So first of all, our problem, right? We're going from right to left. So our problem is identifying, clarifying, and trying to understand this method. So in looking at the structure, we need to assess what we got here, okay? So we're looking at these pieces, and then what's closely related to that is the diagnosis, or finding its meaning. So in assessment, what is this? But in diagnosis, it's what does this mean? Okay? Assessment is what is this, and diagnosis is what does this mean? Or what purpose could it have? So when we look at these, I can go, well, this is actually a spindle. This is a spindle, and I can recognize its structure and find the pattern. By looking at their structure, I see there's a pattern. This is a spindle, this is a spindle, this is a spindle. Oh, this looks like a spindle, but it's actually a baseboard. This is a base. This looks like a spindle, but it's actually a base. This could be a spindle, right? If you looked at it this way, but if you looked at it this way, it's a base. Alright? This is a piece of yucca, but that's going to be a base, right? Here's our cedar board. A piece of sodal, and that's going to end up being a base, right there. Piece of bamboo, I mean, this is obviously going to be a base. And this piece of aspen is going to be a base. So here we kind of have found a pattern within that, so you can kind of understand that. Now the plan will be, how do we get these to work? Okay, so the plan is, how do we balance the variables? What are the variables? How do we balance those variables? Okay, and then we have to actually do it, which is to intervene. And then we evaluate, did we get a call? Okay, now I kind of already showed you the basic form. So we're in our second segment, and we are beginning the learning the variables in the basic form, the basic method. So what we're doing really is we're going to go from right to left, because what we're doing at this stage really, okay, down here, is what we're doing is we're looking at the structure. Okay, what I have here is SX structure. What is the problem? And we need to assess our assessments by looking at the structure. What is this? We diagnose by trying to figure out what the variables are by finding patterns. So we're looking at the structure of the method, and we try to see patterns within the method, and then we kind of give it a name. We kind of know, oh, okay, I can recognize that and see that for what it is. And then we kind of need to figure out how we're going to put that together. Then we intervene, or we actually put it together. We're actually doing the method. We evaluate. Did we get a call or did we get a fail? You know, so what was actually the result? Can we keep reproducing the results? And then we realize if we're being functional or not with that. So in going this way, going from right to left, it's used for understanding and identifying function and or purpose, or basically knowing and understanding the method. So we're going to go this way first. Alright, well, I know that was a lot of stuff to go over before we even go into the methods, but with any true vocation or life-supporting skill, there's a lot of preparatory information that goes into that. I mean, to be a nurse is 3 years of college minimum, and sometimes 4. I mean, the police academy has, you know, the police have the police academy, military has basic training. There's a lot of things you need to know before you can actually do step up and like do things like clinicals or, you know, ride-alongs or whatever it is that vocation is. But now I am able to actually go over this board very quickly with you, now that we've gone over all that information. So we have the equation here, and as I mentioned before, it goes two ways. If the equation goes function, variables to form, we're using it to create structures or forms to solve problems. But if we go the other direction where it goes form, variables to function, we're using it for understanding or identifying the function and purpose of what it is that we're seeing. Okay, so we start off with function and core theory number 1, which is the single natural law theory of equilibrium and the 3 natures. So the universe, the first nature in its totality, doesn't care whether you live or die, but you have to follow the rules. And then there's Mother Nature, which includes the life value theory discovered and clarified by Dr. Humphrey, okay, living on planet Earth kind of thing. And it is probably our most universal and only absolute value that we have. Then there's the third nature, which is human nature. So with that, we will, understanding the life value theory, we want to clarify what it is, what relative life supporting value or life living need that is the problem that we need to figure out, the problem we need to solve. What is the need? Well, in this case, it's friction fire keeping. And then we go more specifically into the method. Okay, so in between all that is the 22 variables we went over. Okay, and now we're going to do advanced hand drill, or hand drill part 2. And as I start to go over stuff, now I am able to run down this list, because now you have full understanding as to function, as to what all the variables are, and the form that you're going to be looking at. Okay? And the first thing that we'll be starting to do is looking at natural materials. And like I had said with the mots earlier with my great grandparents, you must do traveling to go to places, to find things, and in order to acquire a better life. Well, in this small little instance, how that translates is if you're going to do real friction fire keeping, you have to get natural materials. And the way you're going to get natural materials is to go out in the field, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and you got to go find it. You got to identify it, you got to collect it, and you have to prepare it. And all of that takes a bit of moving around. So just like our ancestors used to do, and in order to find a better life, you got to move around and do stuff. Okay? Alright, so now I'm going to start showing you some natural materials that I've collected and some of the coals that I've gotten with that. Alright? So before I go over these 13 different kinds of natural materials, I want to show you 2 techniques. One is called floating, the other is called climbing. And these are very helpful in your hand drill method because they help economize energy. Alright, so for example, when I showed you the basic technique with the bamboo, I mentioned that there's a warm-up period, like you're going to boil your water, and then you start to add the real pressure so that you can ignite it and create dust, right? Those 2 kinds of friction. So with floating, floating and climbing is basically the same, except you move your hands just a little bit different. Now, In the regular technique of the hand drill, you start with your fingers and your palm together like this and use as much surface area as you can. But when you do floating, you put your hands on an angle like this and you kind of scoop upward like this. So this hand pulls down while the other one goes up. And then that hand and those hands reverse, and then the other hand pulls down while the other one scoops up. Now I'm gonna try to do this in slow motion so you can kind of see the form. And what ends up happening is you end up staying in one place. And a lot of times you want to do that and stay near the top. Now, floating technique is really good for doing your warm-up, for example. So what I'm going to do is, instead of just putting all my pressure down and going down the board for the warm-up, I'm just going to relax and just spin the stalk with just the weight of my arms and just a little bit of my body. Okay, we get into a rhythm here. And you see that my hands won't go down the stalk. But still, I'm getting enough speed. I'm making friction because there's dust forming in the notch. You could probably see some smoke. And then when I feel the board is warmed up, I can go down. And now here's where climbing comes in. Okay? With a little bit more effort, I can keep the stalk from cooling down. Here the stalk doesn't cool down. I don't have to stop like this, go and raise my hands up. I just go right back up the stalk if I want to. And I can climb back up again if I want to and not let it cool down. Or I could just stay in a floating technique. Sometimes it's so subtle, it's hard to see. And there we have it. So along with this floating technique and the climbing technique, I have just shown you goldenrod. Goldenrod. Goldenrod, as you know, is one of the problem makers of hay fever, along with ragweed. And this was done on a base of Douglas fir, which is a piece of lumber from the hardware store. So, goldenrod, nice and straight. You know, it has those, they're usually a cluster of yellow flowers. There's hundreds of different kinds, so I'm not going to name every one, obviously. But goldenrod is an excellent one. Just make sure, just as you prepare all these, that again, it's nice and straight, okay? Where the leaves are, make sure everything is nice and smooth. Goldenrod has a bark, a brown bark, when it's dry, and what you want to do is shave off all that bark so that none of that bark is an issue and destroys the stability of the creating the dust in the notch so that pieces don't go flying in there instead of dust that is created. Goldenrod is also naturally hollow, has a little bit of a pith, and the walls are fairly thick, which is really good. They're not too thin. As I go over some of these natural hand drills, when you're collecting, you have to look to see whether you're going to have enough surface area too. Sometimes the walls are too thin. Sometimes you'll see that your stalks, your spindles are fairly brittle, which is another thing we're going to go over in a bit. But goldenrod makes an excellent one. Oh. Lamb's quarter stalk. Lamb's quarters is another great one, but its personality structurally is a little odd. If you're, first of all, you have to find one that is thick enough. A lot of times the lamb's quarters that you'll find in farmers' fields and disturbed soils and things like that, sometimes they're just not thick enough. Well, this one is just barely 3/8 of an inch. So it just got in there. The other thing too you have to look for with lamb's quarters is depending on how it grows. Again, I'm going to mention the surface area. Some are too thin. The walls, it is a pithy plant, so it's not specifically hollow, but it has pith, and they can be rather fragile. For example, there's this one that I was working with, and as I'm trolling it, bam, it just snaps on me, which again we're going to go over about things like that later. But the personality of lamb's quarter is that as it dries sometimes, or as it grows, it has these grooves that run longitudinally through the stalk. So sometimes it's hard when you're looking down where the spindle is going to mate with the base. It may not be perfectly cylindrical, which is important because you're going to have an awful lot of bad sidewall friction, which you don't really want. So here we have some Atlantic white cedar. You can see this one actually is not all that straight. But sometimes your technique can make up for that. So for example, if I do my floating technique at the top, I might be able to keep a straight axis. Let's see if we could just get this to smoke. And we're getting some smoke. There's our coal. Lamb's quarter. Not to mention that the leaves are edible. Makes an excellent salad plant or spinach plant. Remember, your identification skills are very important. Cattail is another great one. Here's some that I collected during the winter. These are the heads. These are the seed heads that are left. And up top, it's always too thin for you to use as hand drill material. So you got to get down to the base. Okay, the bases are thick enough, so you have to use those. After you strip the leaves, usually about a foot up from the base. Usually the middle third is usually makes a good stalk. It's what usually does the job. And cattail, as you probably also know, is an edible. The near the roots, the corms, you can make into flour. One of the most famous recipes is cattail pancakes from the flour. But a cattail stalk spindle is excellent. It is a solid. It's not a hollow. But what makes it great, though, along with the yucca, is that it's a very low density spindle. So because it's a solid and that it's low density, that makes it easier for you to be able to perform the hand drill. So here I have a board of Atlantic white cedar. Here we have our yuccas. We even have yucca boards. Here we have a yucca stalk, which I just mentioned along with the cattail. It has, in the summer, these beautiful white flowers, which are edible, like a salad edible. And the leaves that grow out of the base are one of probably the most excellent cordage materials that you could find. And some yuccas, the leaves, they have a tiny needle on the tip, and if you can bang out your cordage just right, your threads, your fibers, your cordages are still attached to that needle. So if you're going to do any kind of like stitching or sewing, it comes with its own needle, which is pretty amazing to have in nature. Mother Nature, I should say. So yucca is a solid. As you can see here, it's not hollow as it's split. And find some good round sections. And yucca makes an excellent bow drill spindle as well as hand drill material. Now, this particular yucca that you see here, this stalk, is too thick to be a hand drill. So this one will be turned later into a couple bow drill spindles. There's a few in there. There's not just one, there's many. And here is a yucca stalk. Yuccas, sometimes you'll notice they have these insects that will burrow into the stalk during the summer months, and later as it dries out they emerge and they create all these little holes. As you can see on the stalk, those are all exit holes from the insects that were in there. And this one, this particular stalk is short, it's 10 inches, but it's manageable. And I'm just going to give you an idea how, again, we do it's hard to go down on a stalk this short, so what you do is you have to do the floating technique in order to get that going. Here we have the amaranth, spindles. Our next example is an amaranth, also known as pigweed. It looks very, very similar to lamb's quarter, but if you're into your plant identification, you'll notice the subtle differences. Amaranth also makes an excellent salad, as well as a spinach. And amaranth, if you don't know, also makes an excellent flour from its little tiny seeds. If you go to health food stores, sometimes you could find amaranth flour for baking. Amaranth is also a pithy type hollow, and is an excellent hand drill. If you could find one that's kind of straight, sometimes where the leaves come off, it ends up having a slight curve to it everywhere there happens to be a good branch that comes off. So this one isn't perfectly straight, but its axis is straight enough. In these really, really thin stalks, if a split starts in the spindle at the bottom, now what can that do? That can happen sometimes is it catches the wedge of the notch. And if it catches inside the wedge of the notch, the split will just go wide open and then just completely wreck the bottom of your spindle. So this amaranth is really, really thin. But once you get it abraded and sanded down, it may be able to work on you, as fragile as it is, but try to find, again, a thicker walled one when you're collecting. The real key is that while you're collecting, don't waste your time gathering just anything. You have to know what you're looking for when you're collecting. Velvet leaf. All right. So one of my favorite cordage plants is velvet leaf. And as the name suggests, the rather wide leaves of the velvet leaf, they feel very velvety, and they're one of the best cordage plants around. Catch them early when they die, as soon as, like, after the first frost, things like that. Try to collect them and then put them away so that they don't deteriorate too badly, in order to save on those fibers. After a while, the fibers get very fragile if they decay too long out during the winter months. But find a nice straight stalk. This one isn't incredibly straight, as you can see the bend in it. Okay. But sometimes your technique can, again, make up for that. Now the velvet leaf is, again, another pithy hollow, has pith. This one's got some good surface area. It's perfectly round. It's nice and cylindrical. That I have to say about the velvet leaves, that they're good like that. A lot of good surface area there. and I'll show you. Makes a good spindle. Climb back up. So in some of these pictures you see, I always say that it's very important to clean up. Well, sometimes I get all kind of mad scientists and my place ends up being a mess. So some of these pictures that you'll see that the place is a complete mess because I'm doing a lot of experimenting. But I clean up afterwards because that's a good habit to have. I recommend that you do it too, and I always try to keep on that as best as I can when I can, right? Teasels. Now this particular spindle is called a teasel. I love teasels actually. They're found in disturbed soils, on the side of highways, farmers' fields. When you actually collect the dead stalk, it almost looks like a spindle of bamboo. I mean, it almost seems to have like nodes of bamboo, and except that with the bamboo, leaves and branches usually come off to one side. Well, with the teasels, branches and leaves kind of come off alternately, oppositely, on each node. But the thing that you absolutely must remember about teasels is that they have very sharp spines. So when you go to collect these, make sure you have gloves on because you'll get stuck. They have good thick walls, and they are actually a complete hollow. There's no pith, but where the nodes are, it's cut off like bamboo. There's actual chambers that are hollow, just like bamboo, which is very interesting as a plant. So here we're going to do teasel on a half yucca base, and I already carved the notch in. I burned it in. It's a little high, so I filled it with a little coal extender, and we're going to give it a go. Get it warmed up. And we're going to add our pressure, a little more speed, pressure and speed. It looks like we got it already. That was quick. Teasel's really nice. Burdock. Here we have burdock. Burdocks are another great one. When I used to teach the cooking workshop at the wilderness school, I remember wrapping all the fish that we would cook in the huge burdock leaves, and everything always came out so nice. But burdock stalks, they can be pretty tricky if you're not careful. A lot of them get fairly curved, and sometimes it's really hard sometimes to find a good straight section. But what really throws it off is how the branches come off, because every time a branch decides to come off the stalk, it curves the spindle, as you can see. The spindle goes this way, then the spindle goes this way, the stalk goes this way. Each time a branch comes off, you can see that it takes the straightness out of the stalk spindle. But they make also excellent hand drills as well. Evening Primrose. Evening Primrose is another great one, but I'll tell you what's really great about Evening Primrose is that it's a huge plant that grows very, very straight most of the time, but when you grab one of these, you're not just grabbing one. I mean, you're grabbing many hand drills, and you're grabbing many bow drill spindles, because there's just so much of the plant, and most of it is all nice and straight. So if you found a couple of Evening Primrose plants in one area, when you're ready to collect in winter, you're going to be set for a good long time. And it's one of the best hand drill materials and bow drill materials that you're going to find for spindles. Okay? The bark has a bit of kind of a fibrous structure to it. So again, you have to make sure that you've got all that off. Actually, with basically all of these plants, they're going to have some kind of bark that needs to come off. Make sure there's nothing structurally wrong with the spindle cylinder. Make sure it's perfectly round where it meets with the board. Make sure there's nothing in the way there, and then it spins freely, kind of like a ball joint. Alright, thistles. Now thistles, like the teasel, has a lot of spines on it. So again, you have to be very careful when you're collecting, because it's really going to hurt your hands. Now thistles, also kind of like the teasels, can have like a node-like section where it's hollow in the chambers in between, like this thistle. But there's many different kinds of thistles. Like this little short thistle here, which was all that I could collect that was straight and had a thick enough wall and looked good enough, was a milk thistle. This thistle here, though, has hollow chamber, has the nodes, and the walls are just thick enough, but they are rather fragile. In fact, when I first started learning hand drill, I didn't think that you could use thistles because they were such a succulent. When we would teach the edible plant section, we were always telling people that if you need a good water source right away, you take your knife and you strip the spines off of the thistle, and all that succulent material you could just choose, get all the water out of it, spit it out, spit out all the fibrous material, just get it for the water. But I never thought, because it was a succulent, I never thought that it was strong enough or good enough for a hand drill, until someone showed me once that it actually is. And it does make excellent hand drill material. And again, you have to, like all of these plants, collect them before they decay too long out in the winter weather, if that's your climate. Here we have great lettuce. So here I have a few examples of some wild lettuce. Okay, or great blue lettuce, one of those. So the thing about lettuce is it's very fragile, and I notice that a lot of times when for a hand drill, I'm pushing in, if the top has a split in it, that split is just going to keep going. I'm basically going to, the stability of the spindle is really no good if it starts with a split and you're trying to push in and down. This whole thing is just going to cave in and crack and just be awful. The other thing too is you have to be really careful there's no splits in your wild lettuce where the spindle meets the base, because if that catches, that's going to rip apart too. If, like, for say it catches in the notch and while you're spinning it, it'll just totally blow apart. So lettuce, once it's dead, is really a true hollow. There's no pith in there either. So it's got a big lumen in the center of it here. Now what I've done here, just for demonstration's sake, is I've taken just some black electrical tape and I've gone around the stalk where I put my hands to support it so it just won't fracture under the stress and break apart. So just to give you an example here, I have a piece of Atlantic white cedar baseboard, and I'm just going to kind of spin it for you. Just get a little smoke action just to get an idea. And there we go. So we got some smoke. And I can feel the tip kind of blowing apart at the top. And if it wasn't for the tape, this really just wouldn't hold together all that well. Trying to do my floating method. I got a lot of smoke. And I've gone through the board. So So I went straight to the board because I was near the end anyway. But you can see it can hold up and it can give smoke, and I got dust that looks really, really well. So we're just going to keep going with all the other natural materials. Dogbane. Okay, our next one is Dogbane. And Dogbane, when it's young, can look very similar to milkweed, which also makes a very good spindle as well. Milkweed tends to crush like the wild lettuce when you start to put pressure on it. And a lot of times it just won't hold up for hand drill material. But you could use it as bow drill material, a bow drill spindle, as well as the reloads, which I'm going to go over next. But Dogbane, as well as the milkweed, are excellent cordage plants. So the inner barks of these plants have excellent fibers. So if you're going to do any kind of fiber or cordage project, these are excellent plants to have, especially the Dogbane. The Dogbane, I think, is even better than the milkweed. So again, remove the bark all the way down to the wood to remove the fibrous material, so that doesn't interfere with the notch. Because sometimes if you don't do that, you'll get like a brush effect. Okay, so if you have fibers hanging off of your spindle, as you spin the spindle, the fibers that are hanging act like a brush and actually start destroying your coal, which is in the notch. It actually brushes away your coal. So you don't want that. So make sure that your notch is clear of any kind of things that are going to destroy it. So here we're floating the top to just kind of warm it up. Going to go down, and we're going to work our way up the spindle. So our next batch are mullins. Mullins, you usually find a whole bunch of them growing together in a field, some kind of disturbed soil. And they make excellent hand drill as well as bow drill materials, if you find them thick enough, which usually that's no problem. In fact, usually you have DOJO'S spindles at the bottom, plenty of hand drill materials at the top, and you have to get rid of the torch-like, almost cattail-like seed head that's at the top, because that's always going to be too thin. So for example, this is how thin it gets near the top, and this is actually less than 5/16. So this stalk, even though it looks very good, doesn't have the surface area. Anything less than 5/16 I think does not have the surface area to qualify to be able to even start a coal, unfortunately. So, and as much as this one looks similar, right next to it, it is just under 3/8. But it does have enough surface area to be able to perform that duty. Even though the diameters look somewhat similar, this one still is just thick enough. It's not perfectly straight. It does have a bend in it, as you can see. Its axis is off, but you may notice that if I could float near the top, okay, then the middle doesn't matter if I could stay in one place. But sometimes you can work your way down the stalk anyway, down the spindle. Mullen also has kind of a fibrous bark-like outside, but it's not for cordage. It's too fragile for that. But it's fibrous enough to destroy whatever is in your notch at the time if you're not careful. So, and like all the other spindles, with Mullen especially, you do have to kind of prepare it so it doesn't eat up your hands. So here's a quick clip of me doing a Mullen stalk spindle that I just took out of my bunch over there and fixed up and gave it a test. And I used it on Atlantic white cedar and used the multiple hole method. And the shot that I did there is a close-up of me doing this. So have a look. Now, one of the things that I haven't talked about or mentioned is reeds. Here I have a bunch of reed tubes, and you're probably wondering, like, reeds are very, very common, and a lot of them are straight. They're very tough. They're hollow, and you know, they're kind of in that grass family. Why wouldn't you use this for a hand drill? Well, I have never had success with reeds for a hand drill, and mainly for two reasons. I think that there's not enough surface area, for one thing, to be able to work with the friction. I think there's just not enough. What I usually end up doing is, if I'm successful at spinning this spindle, is I just end up cutting through the board. I just basically drill a hole through the board without even getting a coal, for whatever reason. And obviously a button fills the lumen as I'm drilling down. Now, the other problem that I have all the time is that when I put inward pressure on the reed, what ends up happening is I end up just crushing it. It's so fragile that I'm never able to really even support the ability to finish going down the spindle at all. Even when I try floating at a node, it usually doesn't end up working out very well. It ends up just breaking up and cracking. You can see I could just break it with my fingers. So imagine putting pressure on it with both my hands pushing in together. I was only ever successful once with reed, and it was a really, really thick piece, about that long, and I used it for a bow drill spindle, which I'll probably show you later when I go over bow drill. But otherwise, I have never been successful with a reed, ever, for a hand drill. I mean, play with it, give it a shot, see what happens, you know, just get the experience of what it feels like, what it's like. But, well, good luck with that. That's all I gotta say. Okay?